The morning they changed the locks, the temperature had already dropped to 31 degrees. Margaret Calloway stood on the front porch of the house she had lived in for 42 years, a small cardboard box balanced in her arms, wearing the same blue cardigan she had worn every winter since 1987. The cardigan was thin now, the elbows almost translucent with wear, but she had never once considered throwing it away. Some things, she believed, were worth keeping no matter how worn they became. She was 75 years old. She had $214 in her checking account, a cell phone with a cracked screen, and nowhere to go. The locksmith would not look at her. He kept his eyes on the deadbolt, his breath making small clouds in the frozen air. The man standing behind him, the one who had called the locksmith, who had signed the paperwork, who had, if truth be told, engineered every step of this morning, did look at her. He looked at her with a flat, almost bored expression, the way a person looks at something they have already decided has no value. That man was her son. His name was Clifton. He was 48 years old, wore Italian leather shoes even in November, and had recently had his teeth whitened to a shade that Margaret privately thought was unnatural. He was holding a folder of legal papers and a cup of coffee from the expensive cafe 3 blocks away, and he said the words that would ring in her ears for months to come, "Mom, this is just business. You'll understand eventually." She did not understand. Not then. But what happened next, what she found inside a basement she had not entered in over 30 years, would rewrite not only her future, but would expose something that had been buried far longer than anyone could have imagined. Get ready, because what Margaret discovered in that basement was never supposed to be found. If you have ever been made to feel like a burden by someone who was supposed to love you, if you have ever been pushed out, written off, told you are too old or too slow or simply in the way, then this story is for you. Because Margaret's story is really about what happens when the world bets against someone who hasn't finished yet. It's about the things we inherit that we don't even know we're carrying. And it's proof that being forced to start over is not the end of your story. Sometimes, it's the very beginning of the most important chapter. Stay with us because the ending of this one is going to stay with you. Margaret was born in 1948 in a small town in eastern Ohio called Garnet Falls. It was the kind of town that barely made maps. 3 churches, a grain elevator, a hardware store where they still knew everyone's name. Her father worked in a steel processing plant 20 miles away and came home each evening with dark crescents of grime beneath his fingernails that never quite washed out. Her mother, Evelina, kept the house with a fierce and quiet pride. Every surface was scrubbed. Every meal was made from scratch. Every dollar was accounted for in a small green ledger that sat on the kitchen counter like a second Bible. Evelina was not a warm woman in the conventional sense. She did not give easy hugs or say, "I love you," casually. But she showed her love in the way she handed Margaret her lunch bag every morning, always packed with exactly the right things, the apples sliced the way Margaret liked, the thermos filled with the sweet tea she knew her daughter preferred. And she showed it in the way she talked to Margaret late at night when the house was quiet, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of chamomile tea, telling her in a low, serious voice, "You come from strong women, Margaret. Don't let the world forget that." Margaret never did forget. But for a long time, she tucked it away the way you tuck away something precious, carefully, in the back of a drawer, under other things, almost hidden from herself. She married young. His name was Robert Calloway, a gentle, broad-shouldered man who worked in residential construction and smelled perpetually of sawdust and machine oil. They moved to a neighborhood in western Pennsylvania called Fernwood, a tidy middle-income street of 2-story houses with small yards and chain-link fences and neighbors who waved from driveways. They bought the house at 412 Birchmore Lane in 1974 for $38,000, which was every cent they had between them and then some, a small second mortgage from a local credit union to cover the gap. It was the right house. Margaret knew it the moment she walked through the front door and smelled the old wood and the faint trace of someone else's cooking and the peculiar dusty warmth that old houses carry in their walls. She put her hand flat against the doorframe and felt something settle inside her, the way a compass needle settles when it finds north. She raised 3 children in that house. Clifton was the oldest, then a daughter named Renee, and finally a boy named Thomas who came into the world 11 years after Clifton and grew up almost like an only child because of the gap. Robert was a good father, steady, present, quietly devoted. He coached Little League on Saturday mornings and drove kids to emergency rooms at midnight without complaint and told the same 3 jokes at every Christmas dinner for 20 years. Margaret loved him with the practical, unshowy devotion of someone who has chosen well and knows it. They were not wealthy, but they were solid. Robert's business grew slowly and responsibly through the 1980s, and by 1991 he had a small contracting firm with 6 employees and a good local reputation. They paid off the mortgage in 1999, a moment Margaret remembered with disproportionate emotion. She had stood in the kitchen holding the satisfaction letter from the credit union and cried, briefly and without warning, in a way that surprised even herself. Robert died in 2009. A stroke, sudden and complete, on a Tuesday morning in March when he had gone downstairs to make coffee and never came back up. He was 63 years old. The business passed to Clifton, who had been working in it since his late 20s. That was the first thread. And Margaret, in her grief, had not noticed it being pulled. Here is what she did not fully understand at the time, and would only piece together years later. Robert had trusted Clifton not because Clifton had earned that trust completely, but because Clifton was the oldest son, and in Robert's world, that meant something. He had added Clifton's name to the business accounts and given him power of attorney for business matters 18 months before the stroke, during a period when Robert had been worried about his own health after a minor heart event. It had seemed like sensible planning. It had not seemed like a door being opened. The business did well at first. Clifton was ambitious and smart and presentable in a way that brought in larger contracts. For the first few years after Robert died, he sent Margaret a monthly check, described informally as profit share, that covered her basic expenses and then some. She never asked too many questions. She was grieving. She trusted her son. He was Robert's son, after all, and she had really deeply believed, that some of Robert lived on in him. But then the checks became irregular, then smaller. Then, in 2019, they stopped. Clifton explained it in a phone call that lasted less than 4 minutes. The market was difficult, he said. The business was restructuring. He had new investors who required him to formalize things. He was sorry, but the informal arrangement couldn't continue. Margaret had not been prepared. She was 66 years old by then, with a part-time job at a fabric store that paid $11 an hour, and a savings account that contained slightly less than she had assumed because she had trusted Clifton to manage several investments that had not, he now revealed, performed well. She adapted. She always adapted. She picked up extra shifts at the fabric store and she cut her grocery budget, and she told herself it was temporary, that Clifton was under pressure, that he would come through. She called him every few weeks. He was usually brief and distracted. He said things like, "I'm working on it, Mom," and "let's talk next month," and "you know how it is." She did not know how it was. But she believed him, because she had spent nearly 5 decades believing in her children the way Evelina had believed in her, with a completeness that left no room for alternatives. And then 2021 arrived, and Renee called Margaret from Cleveland with a trembling voice and said, "Mom, you need to sit down. I have to tell you something about Clifton and the house." Margaret sat down in the blue floral armchair by the living room window, the one that had been in that room since 1983, and she listened to what her daughter told her. The listening took 11 minutes. By the end, her hands were cold. The house at 412 Birchmore Lane, the house she had lived in for 42 years, the house Robert had touched with his own hands 100 times, the house that held every Thanksgiving and every Christmas morning and every ordinary Tuesday that had made up her life, had been refinanced. Twice. Without her knowledge. And a portion of the equity had been withdrawn and directed into a business account that Clifton controlled. There was paperwork, Renee said. Paperwork that Margaret had signed, but couldn't remember signing, because it had been slipped in among other documents during a period when Margaret had been managing Robert's estate and signing things on a daily basis, trusting Clifton to explain what was in front of her. "He forged your name on some of it," Renee said quietly. Or, "I don't know if it was forged, but you need a lawyer to look at it, Mom." Margaret sat in the blue chair for a long time after Renee hung up. The house was quiet around her. The refrigerator made its usual low hum. Outside, a car went slowly down Birchmore Lane, its headlights sweeping across the living room wall. She had been planted in this house. And someone had been quietly uprooting her. She hired a lawyer, a younger woman named Patricia Ellsworth who practiced out of a small office on Claremont Avenue and charged $200 for an initial consultation, which meant Margaret ate ramen for 3 days that week to cover it. Patricia was precise and unsentimental, the kind of person whose face reveals very little, and she spent 40 minutes reviewing the documents Renee had emailed before she set them down and said, simply, "This is complicated, but it is not unfixable. However, we are going to need time and money, and I want to be honest with you about both." Time and money. The two things Margaret had the least of. The legal process was slow and expensive and frequently demoralizing. Clifton retained a firm with 4 attorneys and a paralegal who sent letters that ran to 12 pages and were designed, Patricia explained, to be exhausting. The strategy, she said, was attrition, to make the process cost more than the outcome was worth, and to hope that Margaret would give up. "They're betting you'll fold," Patricia said at one point, frankly. "Then they don't know me very well," Margaret said. But the truth was, the pressure was immense. Margaret's legal fees reached $14,000 by mid-2022, paid in installments with money borrowed against her small remaining savings, against the tiny life insurance policy Robert had left, against the desperate generosity of Renee, who was herself a schoolteacher with 2 children and a mortgage and not much surplus. And then the legal process hit a wall. A crucial piece of documentation, the original title transfer records from 2009, could not be located in the county records in the expected form. Without it, Patricia said, they were working with one hand tied behind their backs. In November of 2022, a judge granted a temporary injunction that allowed Clifton to proceed with a forced sale of the property to recover what he claimed were outstanding business debts in which the house had been used as collateral. The eviction notice arrived on a Wednesday. Margaret had 60 days. Renee offered her couch. Thomas, who lived in Arizona with his wife and 2 teenagers, sent money and called every evening and said, "Mom, just come here, please," with a desperation that made Margaret's heart ache because she knew she was frightening him. Her friends, a small, loyal circle of women she had known for decades, gathered around her with practical love, bringing food, helping her pack, offering spare rooms and pull-out sofas. But 60 days passes the way cold water passes, faster than you expect, more completely than you prepare for. On January 14, 2023, at 9:17 in the morning, the locksmith changed the locks on 412 Birchmore Lane while Clifton stood on the porch in his Italian shoes drinking his expensive coffee, and Margaret stood there too, holding her cardboard box, wearing her thin blue cardigan, and not crying, not yet, because she had decided on the drive over that she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "Mom, this is just business. You'll understand eventually." She walked to Renee's car. She put the box in the back seat. She got in the passenger side and she closed the door, and then, only then, when the car had pulled around the corner and the house had disappeared from view, she bent forward and put her face in her hands and made a sound she had never made before. A low, hollow sound, from somewhere deep and old, the sound of something that has held its shape for a very long time finally breaking. Renee drove without saying anything. She reached over once and put her hand on Margaret's back. That was enough. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that don't fit neatly into any story you would choose to tell about yourself. They were the weeks you survive rather than live. They were the weeks of sleeping in a familiar place that is not your home, of wearing clothes that don't belong to your drawers, of waking at 3 in the morning with your heart pounding and reaching for something that isn't there. Renee's apartment was on the 2nd floor of a building in East Side Pittsburgh, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that smelled of coffee and children's cereal, a living room where Margaret's air mattress lived at night and was deflated and tucked behind the couch each morning. The building's heating system worked unevenly. Margaret's corner of the living room was always slightly colder than the rest, and she slept in 2 pairs of socks and the blue cardigan and told herself she was fine. She was not fine. But fine was not the goal. Getting through was the goal. She applied for 3 jobs in her first 2 weeks, despite Patricia telling her to rest. She was not built for resting when there was pressure. She applied to a fabric and craft store, a library branch that needed a part-time reader for children's story hour, and a small florist's shop 2 miles from Renee's apartment. She was honest about her age on all 3 applications because she had never learned how to be anything else. The craft store called her in for an interview, and then, after a young manager in a polo shirt looked at her resume for approximately 90 seconds, told her they were looking for someone with more recent customer service experience. She was 75. Her most recent job had been the fabric store she'd left to deal with the legal situation. She thanked him and left and sat in her car in the parking lot for 4 minutes, watching people push carts through the lot, and then she called Renee and said simply, "Next one." The florist hired her. 20 hours a week, $13 an hour. Her manager was a round-faced woman named Dolores who was 61 years old herself and had no patience for nonsense and a deep respect for anyone who showed up on time. Margaret showed up 15 minutes early every single day. Within 2 weeks, Dolores let her arrange the display window, which was a privilege usually reserved for people who had been there at least 6 months. The work was good. It was physical in a way that kept her mind from circling too long. Flowers had a vocabulary she understood, stems cut at angles, water fresh and clean, the brief and transient beauty of things that do not last but are beautiful precisely because of that. Some mornings she would stand at the workbench with her hands in cold water and roses and think, this is what it means to be planted. Not comfortable, not permanent, but growing anyway. Because she had begun to understand something. Being forced to start over is not the end of your story. It's just proof that the story isn't finished. But the story was about to get harder before it got better. Patricia called in late February with news that landed like something cold dropped down the inside of her shirt. A secondary claim had surfaced, a mechanic's lien filed against the property in 2017, which Clifton had apparently allowed to accumulate without notifying Margaret. It complicated the legal picture significantly. If the lien held, even the small amount of equity that Patricia had been fighting to recover from Margaret might be absorbed. "There's something else," Patricia said carefully. "I spoke with a forensic accountant colleague about the business records. There are transactions in 2011 and 2012 that look irregular. But we'd need a lot more documentation to pursue that angle, and I want to be straight with you, Margaret. The cost of that kind of investigation would be significant." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "How significant?" Patricia told her. Margaret did the math in her head. She was making $260 a week at the florist. Her share of Renee's expenses was $600 a month. Her remaining savings after legal fees were just under $4,000. "Then we work with what we have," Margaret said. She was being worn down and she knew it. The sleeplessness was getting worse. She had developed a persistent tension headache behind her left eye that would not fully resolve. Renee watched her from across the apartment with a look that was both loving and frightened, the look of someone watching a person they cannot protect. One evening in early March, Margaret was sitting at Renee's small kitchen table after dinner, a cup of tea going cold beside her, looking at a photograph on her phone, a photo she had taken of the house on Birchmore Lane the last time she'd driven by. The lights were on inside now. Clifton had rented it out almost immediately after the sale. She didn't know who lived there. She had not been able to make herself find out. She was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could reach. She was tired in her bones, in the place where certainty lives. She opened her phone's photo gallery and scrolled back further and further until she found pictures from her mother's house, from the summer 3 years ago when she had gone back to Garnet Falls to deal with Evelina's estate after her mother passed at 91. The pictures showed a small, clean house on a corner lot, 2 floors, a covered porch, a yard with a massive old oak that Margaret had climbed as a child. Her mother had left her the house. That was a fact she had almost forgotten, not because it was unimportant, but because Garnet Falls was 90 miles away and the house had been sitting empty, and Patricia had told her early in the legal proceedings that it was separate property and not at issue. She hadn't been back since the estate paperwork. She looked at the photo of the house for a long time. And then she thought about the basement. Evelina's basement had always been locked. Not just closed, locked, with a padlock on a steel hasp, a combination she had never shared with anyone as far as Margaret knew. Even as a child, Margaret had asked about it, and Evelina had answered in the way she answered questions she did not wish to fully address, with a brief, forward look and a slight adjustment of subject. "Nothing down there that needs to be gotten into," she had said once. And another time, more quietly, "Some things keep better in the dark." Margaret had accepted it the way children accept mysteries too large for them. And then she had grown up and it had receded, the way childhood mysteries do, filed under things that will probably never be known. But sitting there at Renée's kitchen table in the cold March evening, with the tea going cold and her left temple throbbing and her life in fragments, she found herself thinking about it with a new and urgent attention. What had her mother kept locked away for more than 30 years? She called Thomas that evening and told him she was going to Garnet Falls. He was quiet for a moment. "The house. I need to be somewhere that's mine," she said. "Even if it needs work. Even if it's uncomfortable. I need somewhere to stand." She could hear him thinking. "Mom," he said finally, "take what you need. Let us help." The drive to Garnet Falls took 2 hours and 14 minutes on a Thursday morning in mid-March, with a light cold rain that turned to sleet somewhere around the county line and then back to rain again. Margaret drove Renée's spare car, a 2011 Honda Civic with a sticky passenger window and a cassette adapter permanently plugged into the AUX jack from an era when René had still owned cassettes. Margaret drove with both hands on the wheel and the heat on full and a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, and she thought about her mother the entire way. Evelina Marsh had been born in 1930, which meant she had grown up during the Depression and come of age during the war and built her adult life in an era when women of her class and background were required to be resourceful in ways that required no acknowledgement. She had owned that house since 1961. Before that, the house had belonged to her own mother, Margaret's grandmother Frances, who had died in 1958 when Margaret was 10 years old, leaving the property to Evelina. Frances. Margaret had memories of her grandmother mostly in fragments, a particular smell of lavender and wood polish, a voice that was surprisingly low for a small woman, hands that were always doing something, rarely idle. She remembered Frances as someone who watched things carefully, who laughed sparingly but with her whole face, who pressed coins into Margaret's hand on visits with a seriousness that made the gift feel like more than it was. Frances had died before Margaret could know her as an adult. Before she could ask questions. Before she could understand what her grandmother's quiet watchfulness had been built on. The house was exactly as Margaret had left it, small and cold and slightly musty from disuse, but solid as everything her mother had built. The furnace kicked on when Margaret turned the thermostat up, which she had genuinely not been certain it would. The pipes had not frozen over the winter, which was either luck or the thermal mass of the old stone foundation doing its work. She moved through the rooms slowly, letting herself feel the history of the place. The kitchen with its 1970s tile. The living room with its dark wood floors. The spare bedroom where she had slept on visits as a child, with the yellow wallpaper that her mother had never changed. She stood at the window and looked out at the oak tree in the yard, still massive, still there, indifferent to everything that had happened since she had last climbed its lower branches at age 8. Then she stood at the top of the basement stairs. The padlock was still there. Of course it was. But Margaret had gone through her mother's estate with a fine thoroughness. She had had to, legally, and she had kept the small tin of keys from Evelina's bedside table drawer. She had not known what all of them opened. She had assumed she would figure it out eventually. She retrieved the tin from her bag. There were 7 keys inside, of varying ages and sizes. She tried 4 before the 5th one turned in the padlock with a click that was, in that quiet house, genuinely startling. The padlock opened. The hasp swung back. Margaret stood at the top of the stairs and reached for the light switch on the wall and, with a faint prayer toward whatever might be listening, flipped it. The fluorescent tube in the ceiling stuttered twice and then caught, casting a cold white light down the stairs. Margaret went down. The basement was not what she expected. It was not a horror, not a ruin, not a forgotten jumble of a life. It was organized, very deliberately, almost archivally organized, in a way that spoke to significant effort over significant time. There were shelves along the back wall lined with cardboard boxes, all labeled in her mother's distinctive handwriting. There were 2 old filing cabinets in the corner, locked with small key locks. There was a workbench along the left wall with tools hanging above it on a pegboard, each tool outlined in faded paint so you could see its shape when it was removed. There was a wooden steamer trunk against the far wall, the old-fashioned kind with brass hardware, and it was the trunk that drew her eye first. She crossed to it. The brass latch was stiff but not locked. She lifted the lid. Inside was paper. A lot of paper. Documents, envelopes, folders, organized in layers separated by sheets of cardboard. On top was an envelope sealed with tape that had yellowed and stiffened with age, with 2 words written on the front in handwriting that was not her mother's. She recognized it immediately, despite 30 years of distance. It was her grandmother Frances's hand. The 2 words on the envelope said, "For Evelina." Margaret's hands were not entirely steady as she carried the envelope to the workbench and set it under the direct light. She stood there for a moment with her hands flat on the surface, breathing. She could feel her own heartbeat. She told herself, "Open it slowly. Whatever this is, open it slowly." She peeled the tape back carefully. The envelope had been sealed with something beneath the tape, a wax-like substance that had dried and cracked. Inside were 3 folded pieces of paper, a letter, and behind the letter, 2 other documents. She read the letter first. It was dated September 1957, 1 year before Frances died. The handwriting was Frances's, deliberate and slightly old-fashioned, with the particular elegance of someone who had been taught penmanship in an earlier era. It was addressed to Evelina directly, as a mother writing to a daughter. The letter began, "By the time you read this, I will be gone, and I think you will find certain things in this house that I was not brave enough to show you while I lived. I am sorry for that, Evie. I was afraid of what you would think, and I was afraid of making your life harder than it needed to be. But I believe now that I was wrong to keep it from you. And I believe you will know what to do with what I've left." Margaret had to stop and breathe. She continued reading. Frances, it turned out, had known something about the land beneath this house, and the land that had originally surrounded it, before parcels were sold off in the 1940s. In the 1920s, when Frances had first come to this house as a young bride, she had befriended an elderly neighbor, a man named Harlan Drexler who had been a land surveyor for 40 years. Harlan, in the final years of his life, had told Frances something that she had written down and kept and never fully acted on, partly from poverty and partly from the particular way that women of her era had learned not to push too hard against systems that were not built for them. He had told her that the land under this property and the adjacent parcels, land that had been mostly farmland and then been subdivided in the late 1800s, had a specific legal history regarding mineral rights and subsurface easements that had never been properly resolved in the county records. And he had told her there was a deed, an original deed from the 1890s, that contained language about those rights that had been overlooked or deliberately obscured in subsequent transfers. He had given her a copy. It was folded inside the letter. Margaret unfolded it with hands that she now noticed were trembling. It was old paper, thickened with age, slightly brown at the edges, but legible. And it was exactly what the letter had described. She did not fully understand what she was looking at. She was not a lawyer. She was not a land surveyor. She was a 75-year-old woman standing in a cold basement in eastern Ohio, reading a document from the 1890s in the light of a flickering fluorescent tube, and what she understood was this: her grandmother had known. Her mother had known or half known, had kept it, had locked it away, had not known what to do with it, had been afraid of it. And she, Margaret, had almost never found it at all. She sat down on the basement floor, on the bare concrete, in the cold, and she held the letter and the deed against her chest and she said, very quietly, to no one in the room, "Mum, what did you leave me?" But that was just the beginning of what was in that trunk. Over the next 2 hours, she went through every layer. There were old tax receipts going back to the 1930s. There were letters between Frances and Harlan, a series of them, in which he elaborated on what he had found and what it might mean. There were 2 folders containing what appeared to be survey maps, hand-drawn, detailed, with notations in the margin in Harlan's precise surveyor's script. And at the very bottom of the trunk, in a folder that had been sealed with a ribbon and a metal clip, there were 3 documents that Margaret could not immediately interpret but which had the distinctive density and formal language of legal instruments. She photographed everything with her phone. Every page, every document, every survey map. She worked methodically, the way her mother had taught her to work, and when she was done she sat back and looked at the photographs and understood that she was holding something that required more knowledge than she had. She needed help. She needed someone who could tell her if this was real, and what it meant, and whether it mattered. She needed Patricia. But she also, instinctively, knew she needed to be careful. Because if this was what she thought it might be, if it was significant in the way that the weight of it suggested, then she needed to understand it before anyone else knew she had it. Clifton, for instance. She drove back to Pittsburgh that evening with the documents in a bag on the passenger seat, and she kept one hand on it the entire way, absurdly, as if it might be taken from her if she let go. The rain had stopped. The night was clear and very cold, the stars sharp in the way they only are when the air has been washed completely clean, and she drove through that clarity with her heart beating steadily and something unfamiliar replacing the exhaustion in her chest. Something that felt, cautiously, like possibility. She did not call Patricia that night. She waited until morning. She would always tell the story this way later, because patience was something her mother had taught her and she was trying to honor that. She waited until 8 o'clock, which was when Patricia's office opened, and then she called and said simply, "I found something. I can't tell you yet what it is, but I think you need to see it. Can I come in today?" Patricia said yes. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Patricia sat very still as she went through the photographs, and then the physical documents, which Margaret had brought in a manila envelope. She said almost nothing for the first hour. She took notes. She enlarged photographs on her laptop. She made 2 phone calls while Margaret sat in the office chair and looked at the framed prints on the wall, a botanical illustration of a black-eyed Susan, a photograph of Patricia's daughter at what appeared to be a college graduation, and tried to remain calm. When Patricia finally put down her pen and looked across the desk, her expression was the most human Margaret had ever seen it. "I need you to listen to me carefully," Patricia said, "because I am going to be very precise about what I'm saying. I can't tell you yet what this is worth. I can't tell you if the language in this deed will hold up under a modern legal review. But I can tell you that what you've brought me is real. These documents are authentic. I can say that with reasonable confidence from their physical characteristics, and what they describe, if the legal interpretation holds, involves mineral rights and subsurface easements on land that includes parcels that were developed commercially in the 1970s and 1980s. She paused. "Developed commercially how?" Margaret asked. "I need a land use attorney and a mineral rights specialist to confirm the details. But from what I can see in the survey maps, Margaret, the area that Harlan Drexler documented includes land that now sits under a commercial development, including, I believe, a portion of the Clearview Business Park on Route 14. Margaret had driven past the Clearview Business Park her entire adult life. It was a large, flat expanse of warehousing and commercial space on the eastern edge of the county. She had never thought about what was beneath it. "What would that mean?" she asked. Patricia looked at her with a directness that was almost gentle. "If the mineral rights language in this deed holds, and if the subsurface easements were never properly extinguished in subsequent title transfers, and based on what I can see, there is a strong argument that they were not, then there is a legitimate claim to compensation for commercial use of that subsurface access. Potentially a significant one." The room was very quiet. "How significant?" Margaret said. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Significant enough that you need to get a specialist involved immediately, and significant enough that you need to be very careful about who knows you have these documents." Margaret nodded slowly. She thought about Clifton. She thought about the fact that Evelina's house had been separate property, not touched by the legal proceedings, not part of what he had taken. He didn't know about the basement. He had never cared about Evelina's house in Garnet Falls. Too far, too small, too ordinary. He hadn't known to look. "He made a mistake," Margaret said quietly. Patricia looked at her. "Who did?" "Someone who thought he'd taken everything." Margaret looked back at the botanical print on the wall. "He missed something." The specialist Patricia brought in was a man named Gerard Follo, a mineral rights and land use attorney from Columbus who had spent 30 years on exactly this kind of case: historical title disputes, dormant mineral rights claims, subsurface access litigation. He was methodical and unhurried and charged more per hour than Margaret made in a week, but Patricia negotiated a contingency arrangement, meaning he would take his fee from the eventual settlement rather than upfront. That negotiation alone, Margaret would say later, was worth more than she could calculate. Gerard spent 6 weeks going through the documents, the county records, the historical survey data, and a commissioned geological survey of the property in question. He made 2 trips to Garnet Falls. He hired a researcher to trace the chain of title back to the 1870s. He corresponded with the county recorder's office, the Ohio Division of Mineral Resources Management, and 2 other attorneys whose names Margaret did not recognize. He called her on a Thursday in May. "I've completed my review," he said, with the measured calm of someone who has learned not to color the delivery of significant news with too much emotion, because it goes badly for everyone. The mineral rights language in the 1891 deed is valid and has never been extinguished in any subsequent title transfer. That's confirmed. The subsurface easements are documented and legally intact. The Clearview Business Park development in 1978 utilized subsurface access that falls within those easements, without the required negotiation or compensation to the title holder. He paused. The title holder, he continued, at the time of the development, was Evelina Marsh. And as her heir, Margaret, you are now the legal successor to that claim. Margaret was sitting in her mother's kitchen. Her kitchen now, she was beginning to allow herself to call it that, with a cup of chamomile tea on the table in front of her, the same kind her mother had always made. The late afternoon light was coming through the window above the sink, the same window that had thrown light in the same direction on every late afternoon of her childhood. "Am I understanding you correctly?" she said. "You are," Gerard said. "This is real, Margaret. And the entities currently operating within the affected area of the Clearview development have exposure here. We're going to need to proceed carefully, and there will likely be considerable resistance. But the claim is legitimate, and based on comparable cases in Ohio and Pennsylvania, the valuation is in the range of, and I want to emphasize this is preliminary." He gave her a number. She set the cup down very carefully. The number had multiple zeros. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "My mother knew. She knew and she didn't, she couldn't. She may not have known the full scope," Gerard said gently. "What Francis gave her was the foundation. Evelina kept it safe. You found it." Margaret looked out the window at the oak tree. Some things keep better in the dark. Until the right person opens the door. The legal process that followed was not a fairy tale. It was a legal process, which meant it was long, frequently exhausting, punctuated by obstacles and delays and moments of real discouragement. The entities involved in the Clearview development, a commercial real estate management company and its parent corporation, retained formidable counsel and responded to the initial claim with a comprehensive challenge to the deed's validity, the chain of title, and the specific geographic scope of the easements. But here is what they had not counted on. Gerard was very good. Patricia was very good. And Margaret, having been forged by 60 days of notice and 42 years of quiet strength and a childhood spent listening to her mother talk at the kitchen table about what strong women are made of, Margaret was unbreakable in the way that the best things are unbreakable, the way old wood is unbreakable, with a toughness that gives a little and then holds. The discovery process unearthed something else entirely, something that Patricia found in the corporate filings from 1977 and 1978, documentation showing that the development company's predecessor had been aware of the historic easement at the time of construction and had made a deliberate decision not to pursue negotiation or disclosure, calculating that the original title holders, 2 elderly women in a small Ohio town, would either never know or never be able to pursue it. They had been right for 60 years. They had not counted on the trunk. Clifton learned about the claim approximately 4 months into the process, when it became part of public court filings. Margaret was told he had called Patricia's office twice in one day. Patricia had not returned his calls. He called Margaret next. She answered. The call lasted 8 minutes, and it was unlike the call she had imagined having with him. He was not apologetic, she had not expected him to be, and she was past expecting things from him. He was alternately demanding and conciliatory in the way of someone who has just realized they have badly miscalculated. He asked if they could talk about the situation. He implied that they might work together on this. He used the word family 3 times in 8 minutes. She let him finish. Then she said, "Clifton, you told me losing my home was just business. I've decided to take you at your word." She ended the call. He retained a lawyer, the same firm that had handled the eviction proceedings, and filed a claim asserting a partial interest in the mineral rights on the basis of his role in managing the family's assets after Robert's death. It was a thin argument, Gerard said, and it was built on the same questionable paperwork that had already been flagged in the original eviction litigation. But it added weight to the proceedings, and it was clearly designed to do what it had always been designed to do: make everything harder and longer and more expensive. It didn't work. For one specific reason: Renee, who had been quietly and persistently gathering documentation for 2 years, had managed to compile a record of Clifton's irregular financial transfers that was, when presented to the court as part of the counterclaim Patricia filed, deeply damaging to his credibility. There were transfers from business accounts to personal accounts during periods of claimed business loss. There were investment records showing funds that had been directed away from their intended purpose. There were emails, archived, recovered, presented, that showed explicit awareness of the documents Margaret had signed under pressure during the estate proceedings. The judge reviewing the counterclaim called it, in her written ruling, a pattern of financial manipulation conducted over multiple years with the deliberate intent of depriving the plaintiff of property rights to which she was legally and morally entitled. Clifton's claim to any portion of the mineral rights was denied. His liability in the original property dispute was confirmed. The settlement with the Clearview Development's parent company was finalized in November of 2023, 9 months after Margaret had first descended those basement stairs in the dark. The final amount, after legal fees and expenses, was more than Margaret had ever seen in her life, enough to change the rest of it completely, and enough to make her sit in her kitchen in Garnet Falls for a full 10 minutes after Gerard called with the news, just sitting, with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the oak tree in the yard. She did not cry right away. She sat with it. She let it be real. Then she called Renee. Then Thomas. Then Dolores at the florist's shop, because Dolores had never asked questions but had given her 20 hours a week and had let her arrange the window display, and that was a kindness that deserved a phone call. The blue cardigan was hanging on the back of her kitchen chair when she called Dolores, and she looked at it while she talked, and she thought, "I'm not throwing this away. Not ever." What Margaret did with what she found in the basement is not a story about luxury. That's important to understand. She did not suddenly become someone who forgot what it felt like to sleep on an air mattress in her daughter's living room, or what it felt like to do the math on a grocery receipt in the parking lot, or what it felt like to stand on her own porch while someone changed the locks. She remembered. She was built to remember. She had the house in Garnet Falls fully restored, not renovated into something it had never been, but restored, carefully and specifically, to be what it had always been, except sound and warm and right. She hired a local contractor from the county, a woman named June who ran a small crew and had grown up in Garnet Falls herself. The work took 4 months and was done with attention to the original materials, because Margaret believed the house deserved to remain itself. She established a small legal aid fund in partnership with Patricia's firm, a fund specifically designed to help older women in financial and property disputes who could not afford representation. She named it for her grandmother, the Francis Marsh Legal Fund. It was not enormous. It did not have to be enormous to matter. She went back to the florist shop, but differently, she invested in Dolores's business, becoming a silent partner, and the shop expanded into the empty space next door and added an arrangement studio where Dolores began teaching classes on weekends. Margaret helped on Saturday mornings sometimes, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to, because her hands in cold water and roses was still something that held her in the present tense in a way she valued. She fixed the heating system in the Garnet Falls house so that no corner was ever colder than any other. She bought a new cardigan, navy blue, thick wool, from a small shop in downtown Garnet Falls, but she kept the old one on the chair. Some things are worth keeping not because they are perfect, but because they tell you where you came from and what you survived. She planted a garden in the spring. Nothing fancy, tomatoes, herbs, sunflowers along the south fence. She worked in it on evenings when the light was long and warm, in the particular way that spring light is long and warm in eastern Ohio, where the sky opens up wide and the fields go on and everything that looked dead in February is suddenly, impossibly, green. Renee came for a week that summer with the children. Thomas came with his family in August. They sat on the porch in the evenings and looked at the oak tree and talked until late, and Margaret listened to her grandchildren laugh at something in the yard and felt something settle inside her, the way a compass needle settles when it finds its direction. She had been uprooted. That was true. She had been forced out of the place she had grown into, the place she thought she was permanently planted. But here is what she understood now, in a way she had not been able to articulate at the beginning. Being uprooted is not the same as being destroyed. Some seeds need to be moved before they can grow into their full size. Some things, some people, cannot reach what they are capable of until they are forced to look for new ground. She had been planted somewhere she thought was permanent. And when she was pulled out, she had found ground that was older and deeper and more nourishing than anything she had known before. She had found what her grandmother had put there, waiting for someone ready enough to find it. Being forced to start over is not the end of your story. Margaret knew that now, not as a consolation but as a fact, as true as the surveyor's measurements in Harlan Drexler's careful hand, as true as the oak tree's rings, as true as the compass finding north. She sat on her porch one evening in late August, the air warm and soft, the fireflies beginning to move in the yard, and she thought about Evelina sitting at this same kitchen table 40 years ago, holding those documents, deciding to lock them away. She did not blame her mother. She understood her. The world Evelina had navigated had been one in which the safest thing a woman could do with something powerful was hide it and wait. She had waited. And then she had waited too long. But she had kept it. She had kept it in the dark, safely, until someone came who was ready. And Margaret, at 75, after everything that had been taken and everything she had found, understood that she was finally, fully, unambiguously that someone. Some things keep better in the dark, until they find the right light. If this story moved you, if you saw someone you know in Margaret, someone who has been underestimated, pushed out, told they were done when they weren't, drop one word in the comments that describes how this story made you feel. Just one word. Yours might say the very thing someone else needed to read today. And if you know someone who is going through a hard season right now, someone who is sleeping on a couch, starting over, being told the story is over, please share this with them. Sometimes the most important thing another person can give you is the proof that it's possible to come through. We tell stories about people who refuse to be forgotten, who find what was left for them, who turn what was meant to destroy them into something that lasts. If that's the kind of story that keeps you going, stay with us. There are more. Because starting over is not the end of your story. It never was.